Hello and good morning. My name is Ann Mavity. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Housing Partnership, and I'd like to welcome you to Minnesota Housing Partnership's call on our federal and state legislative updates. As most of you know, MHP has been hosting these Friday calls, now it's every other Friday, during the legislative sessions so that we can provide you timely and the critical information to all the housing stakeholders on policy and legislative proposals that are impacting our work in advancing affordable housing. So before we start, I'll just note that we encourage you throughout the program to utilize the chat function during this call, and we'll do our best to monitor the questions and offer those up to our speakers today. And certainly if we don't get to your question, we'll make sure that we're forwarding those to our speakers. So certainly housing continues to be a priority for policymakers at the local level, state and federal levels, and it certainly is a priority for all the folks who are continuing to struggle to make ends meet. So there's a lot going on to address these challenges at the state level and at the federal levels. Committee work is going like gangbusters at the state level, and at the federal level, this third emergency relief package and a lot of other activity is happening. And we're going to hear about all of this great work from our really great lineup of speakers today. So today we will be hearing from the State House Chair of the Capital Investment Committee, State Representative Fue Lee, and we're going to learn more from him about what's happening at the state capitol. We're also going to hear from Jon Gutzmann, who is the Executive Director of the St. Paul PHA. And he is a longtime expert and practitioner on public housing. And he's going to talk about public housing needs that are currently being debated at the Capitol. But we start this morning with our honored guest. We're very honored to host Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. She'll be helping us provide some insights on federal legislation that will impact us here in Minnesota. As a brief introduction, although she doesn't need much of an introduction, as many of you know, Representative Omar was sworn into office in January of 2019. It makes her the first African refugee to become a member of Congress, the first woman of color to represent Minnesota, and one of the first two Muslim American women elected to Congress. And as you know, she had been serving since 2016 as the Minnesota House of Representatives for District 60B in Minneapolis. And then before running for office, she worked as a community educator at the U of M. She was a policy fellow at the Humphrey Institute, and then served previously as a policy aide for the Minneapolis City Council. So currently she serves on the House Budget Committee and on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Welcome, Representative Omar. Are you on the line here?
I am, Anne. Thank you so much for that great introduction. I am no longer on the Budget Committee. I'm now on, I was on Education and Labor, Foreign Affairs and Budget in the last session, in the last Congress, and decided 3 committees was a bit much. And so I am now on the Education and Labor and Foreign Affairs. But thank you all for extending the invitation to be here with you all. It's really great to see everyone after such a chaotic start to 2021. I am relieved and hopeful to start working on our housing priorities in this new united Congress with the Biden administration. Complete suspension and forgiveness for all rent and mortgage payments during the COVID-19. It has been a top priority for me and will remain such. I'm hoping to reintroduce our Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act as soon as possible, potentially the end of this month. I'm sure many of you have heard cases of people experiencing delays in federal assistance. So it's clear that short-term rental assistance and temporary eviction moratoriums are not policies that are sufficient to deal with the massive financial despair and ruin caused by this pandemic. My office is also making some progress in our talks with Senate appropriators who are interested in helping us push for certain funding within our bill that was included in the Homes for All Act that many of you have supported and helped us formulate. which would make a historic investment in our affordable housing stock. Another priority for us will be trying to call for an acquisition fund, an anti-gentrification fund, to be marked up in these committees and possibly included in the reconciliation language. We are also going to have in this $1.9 trillion package the America Recovery Act, $30 billion in rental assistance and utilities assistance, $5 billion of that being earmarked for homelessness. So I'm really happy to continue to work on expanding some of these housing priorities that we have, and just grateful to be here. If any of you have any questions, I will take some.
Well, thank you so much for that. Well, let's just jump in then, because you do have this legislation, this bill called the Cancel Rent Act. And of course, there's so many people right now that are without jobs. They can't pay their rent or mortgage. They're short of money. And we see that even through the demand for food assistance programs, right, that have quadrupled. So can you explain a little bit about how this cancel rent bill works, how it impacts low-income renters? And then you mentioned this acquisition fund, because when we hear cancel rent, there's always the question of, well, who pays for that? And so sort of what's the strategy within that, in your legislation, to make sure that the other side of that equation is addressed as well?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So the Rental Mortgage Cancellation Act would suspend rent and mortgage payments, require HUD to establish funds to fully reimburse landlords and lenders for these payments. This legislation would be non-means tested cancellation of such debt obligations that would take tenants and homeowners out of the process of providing eligibility and applying for these direct payments. These relief funds for landlords and lenders would be widely accessible as long as they agree to a set of fair renting and lending practices for at least 5 years. Particularly, the acquisition fund provision would require the federal government to create a fund to finance in full of purchase of private rental properties for affordable housing by nonprofits, housing authorities, cooperatives, community land trusts, state and local municipalities.
Mm-hmm. And is this bill running separately, or how does this play into this Emergency Relief Act? I know Congress is in recess for the moment, but that we are sort of at the brink of, as I understand it, in terms of timing, that this third stimulus is coming, the 1.9 trillion. Talk about that. Is your bill any of those provisions going to be encompassed within that, or will that run separately? Explain that a little.
Yeah, so the bill as it stands right now, it's got pockets and pools of money for different things that are proposed by the administration and then sent to the Senate to figure out how to put the bill together. And what happened was the Senate gave us some guidelines in the reconciliation process, and then our committees went to work. And so in the Education and Labor Committee, we marked up the educational portion of the America Recovery Act, took 13.5-hour committee hearing to do that. We also raised the minimum wage to $15 as part of that. So we did our work last week. And some of the other committees are doing this. Obviously, housing goes through financial services, and they're still in the process of marking up pieces of their portion. And what we are hoping for is that we can get either some language in there for the current funds that are allocated for housing to be used for what we want in our rent and mortgage cancellation or our Homes for All bill, or we can, once the bill is passed out of committees, we can try to do them as part of amendments and then work with the Senate appropriators to make sure that it stays in there, because once we are done, then they go and do their work.
Mm-hmm. And I had noted, I think, is this the American Rescue Plan? Is this what we're talking about, this 1.9 trillion?
Rescue, not recovery, American Rescue.
Recovery, yeah, rescue recovery. And is that, we have a question here about, I've understood this 1.9 trillion amount. Is that what the CBO has estimated and take the cost of that?
So 1.9 trillion is the price for the whole package of the rescue plan. We don't have estimations for what our proposals will do. Usually when you have a markup planned is when you will ask for the estimations.
And then we have a question in the chat about an anti-gentrification fund. You've spoken to this before. Can you speak to sort of what you're doing along those lines?
Yeah, so our Homes for All legislation that we introduced in the last Congress that we're also hoping to reintroduce soon has an anti-gentrification fund that before we reintroduce the bill that we're hoping to take it out now because we have senators who are appropriators who are interested in helping us fund that fund. And what it would do is that it would establish a new $200 billion program with HUD to be responsible in awarding grants to local governments for the purposes of designing policies and procedures to help rehouse displaced people, regulate exploitative real estate developers, and make tenants' rights a first refusal realistic option.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of, I think one of the interesting and really exciting pieces that's coming along with these relief packages is not just the one-time assistance that's absolutely needed. I know in the bill that was passed, the Emergency Relief Act that was just passed at the end of last year, there will be an additional $375 million coming to Minnesota to help folks pay their rent. Still looking for the assistance for homeowners, but for the renters, that assistance is coming in already. What does this bill or any of these legislation, what's the opportunity for really including some of these longer term structural changes, right? We know that 3 out of 4 renters that are eligible for rental assistance don't receive it because we just don't have enough capacity and funding in the system. Are there opportunities for structural changes as part of these emergency relief legislation?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a really good question, and one as members of the Progressive Caucus that we have been sort of having a work group formed around, because we are spending a lot of money in dealing with the financial crisis that's result of this pandemic, but we know that the financial pain is exacerbated in many parts of our communities because there are systematic challenges that have persisted for decades. And so these sort of band-aid solutions that we're coming up with, and the money that we continue to throw at these problems, knowing that many of our communities are going to have a long time accessing some of these resources. Once these moratoriums are lifted, we're looking at probably a housing collapse, and more than just a crisis. We've been trying to see if we can get the chairs to help us formulate some long-lasting policies and language around some of the fundings that are happening. So I'll give you an example. The reason that we're fighting for the minimum wage is that this is our only opportunity, even though we know that the parliamentarian in the Senate is probably going to say we don't have the ability to do it as part of the reconciliation process. we're going to give it a shot, right? Because this is the only opportunity we might get to pass a $50 minimum wage on a federal level. That was the same thing with my Meals Act, which provided food to 22 million children, that passed as part of the CARES Act, where you no longer have to say whether your family qualifies for free and reduced meals in order for you to go pick up a meal at the schools. Now every single family can go without any question and go to the school and pick up a meal for the kids that are at that school and the ones that are at home. And so we're trying to, and that will hopefully stay as part of the system. And so we're hoping to see if we can try to sneak in some policies like that create flexibility, that transform a system that has so many inequalities embedded in them. And Katie Porter, who was on financial services, who's no longer on that, and I have a little working group where we're trying to figure out how to do that for housing.
That's great. We have a question from Minnetonka City Councilwoman Kissy Coakley, who is asking about how these funds will flow to local municipalities. We know that cities are on the front lines of dealing with these issues, and particularly on housing. It's one of the reasons housing is so complex, is that there's so many levers at state and county and local and federal levels. But for Councilmember Coakley's question, how will this legislation help localities to help address these issues?
Yeah, so I'm going to assume she's speaking of the Recovery Act. One of the things that we learned with the CARES Act was that there was no flexibility, and we sort of missed the mark in trying to place language that would make the funds accessible to states like Minnesota to be able to distribute it to their municipalities, even though we didn't meet the threshold of population in many of the municipalities that exist. So trying to see if we can remove those kind of thresholds and make sure that it is not a legislative process that it takes to sort of release a lot of these funds. We are allocating about $300 billion in state and local funds as part of this 1.9 trillion. That is outside of the 30 billion that I said was going to rental assistance. So obviously municipalities can use their money for that as well, but we also are allocating specific money for that. States can use their money for school reopening and all of that, but we're also giving them direct money for schools to reopen. And so, vaccinations, we're giving them direct money. They can use that 300 billion as well. And so trying to make sure that there's that kind of flexibility, because in the CARES Act, it just took so long for our communities to get the resources that they needed. And every state is unique. And our state was just one that had some challenges. We're obviously the only divided legislature in the country. And so we're going to try to do everything that we can to make sure that doesn't become a hindrance in trying to get the resources to our communities.
Well, let me ask specifically about, we know that housing outcomes are too often predicted by race or zip code, a result of decades and centuries of these intentional policies that have created barriers for people of color to finding housing and accessing home ownership. A recent report, national report, actually found that 53% of Black renters are having unpaid housing bills compared with only 21% of white renters. So we're seeing this. What do you think is some of the most important action at the federal level to ensure that housing achieves these racially equitable outcomes and opportunities in housing?
Yeah, I mean, I often reflect on how Minnesota can be so great, but still have these persisting racial disparities. And that often is not due to policy, but it's due to trying to make these programs accessible and flexible so that it can reach those that are most vulnerable. And to the point of why so many people are still struggling, even though there have been so many resources, is what we tackle in our housing task force here in Minnesota, that you've joined a couple of times, and I know some others on this call are on. Is trying to get rid of some of the barriers that are part and parcel of the applications that we create, the eligibilities that we come up with, and trying to get this information to communities that need it. I mean, we just had about 100 small small business owners who have not gotten any of the CARES money for small businesses. And it's been, nearly a year since we passed legislation and since that money was supposed to trickle down to them. And that's not because they're not eligible, it's because they don't have the resources that they need and the networks in order to be able to access that. And so, this is where partnerships are helpful. This is where we as lawmakers can try to make sure that in the language, there is a clear intent of how this money is supposed to be used, that we make it flexible. Because again, with CARES Act, there was just a lot of resources that were given and less flexibility and clarity in the way in which local communities can use them. I see there's a question about Section 8. In the last package that we passed, there was resources. I can't remember how much money was put in to increase and expand Section 8 vouchers. Chairwoman Waters is advocating for some of these resources to also go into the expansion of that. I think that's one of the systematic things that we can do, is to create a larger fund for Section 8 and expand it with a new secretary at HUD. There is obviously going to be a different partnership for that committee in trying to do what we can in dealing with the housing crisis.
Well, and I think because we know that this Section 8, these housing choice vouchers, they not only benefit, these hardworking, struggling renters, but also they make sure that the housing providers themselves have that rental income to make sure that they can pay their debts, that they can keep those doors open, keep their buildings maintained as well. So it sort of has these dual outcomes when we provide those. And again, we understand that there will be $375 million coming to Minnesota that's already approved, and potentially up to another $300 million in the third one that's under consideration. We know locally that we're looking a lot at structurally, this is great for a one-time, we need this desperately. But what does this mean for the long term? There's a lot of conversations locally at the state level about ensuring that there is everyone, just like a home mortgage interest deduction, everyone who's eligible gets it. If you're a low income renter, gets a rental assistance support. As we look at this eviction moratorium coming off, we know that rental assistance is going to be critical. So with your eviction task force, is that sort of emerging? I know you have co-chairs, Representative Howard and Nalima, who are also helping co-chair this. What are you coming up with in terms of these recommendations on rental assistance? Again, both for providers, but especially for these low-income struggling folks.
Yeah, so we just had our second meeting of the year, and I mean, we haven't put out recommendations yet. What we've been tackling with is sort of, you know, the question that I previously just answered. How do we figure out as a community and people who are invested, ways in which these resources can get to the people that desperately need them. Obviously, you know, there's a limited amount of money, and the need is great. But I know that, you know, the county, municipalities, the state have stepped up to try to say, like, you know, we're going to do as much as we can. But there's still so many people who haven't accessed even what is available. And so trying to figure out ways that we can continue to share information and make it accessible to people. But we'll have recommendations, and we'll share that with you all.
Right. Well, and I know where all of us are sort of trying to put our best minds together to come together to make sure that, you know, eventually the eviction moratoriums will lift, and we need a strategy and a plan so that we don't have waves of folks again who, through no fault of their own, have not been able to pay their housing costs. So we want to make sure that we're avoiding that to the extent that we can with these strategies. So let me shift just briefly to a couple. We've got just have a couple more minutes left. One about really looking at administrative, what's happening at HUD. We've seen the Biden administration already has reversed some of the discriminatory policies in terms of banning, you know, trans folks and others from accessing shelter and such. But let's talk about fair housing. You know, how do we make sure that HUD doesn't just go back to the status quo framework, and that we actually lean into this affirmatively furthering fair housing? Is that work that you're also involved in?
Yeah, I'm really optimistic that Marcia Fudge will be leading HUD. She's been a sister, an auntie, and a mentor to me in Congress. I think she's the reason I survived for my first 2 chaotic months in Congress. And really feel excited to have somebody that I know and have a relationship with, to have a partner there. I think she's very much, you know, someone who is a champion for justice and for poor people in this country. And there is a lot of opportunity for us to, you know, applaud her leadership, because she will take bold stances, and to also make recommendations and push her to see things differently when you know, our interests don't align. And so I think that things will, in a very short time, improve and expand in HUD.
Good to know, actually, and also that you have a good relationship, because certainly we do a lot of work with HUD as well. So thank you. So I think the last question I just want to note or ask you about is sort of what comes next. You know, we know that there's, in terms of infrastructure bills coming through, and there's so many competing demands. Certainly housing, as we all know, is the foundation to make sure that everything else in our life works. What do you see sort of over the next several months in terms of what we can expect and what we can continue to work with you on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is obviously going to be a big infrastructure bill. There will be opportunities for us to put a lot of housing related infrastructure bills as part of that package. So if there are particular recommendations that you all have, we'd be interested in coming up with amendments to do that. There will be a reintroduction and probably a better housing bill like the one that the chairwoman Waters did in the last Congress. Again, it didn't go as far as many of us would have liked, but it did have a lot more money and some structural changes for Section 8 and public housing and the likes. And so there's opportunity there. There's an energy bill that we will formulate soon, and there is opportunities that are going to exist for housing in that piece of legislation. There is an immigration package that we're working on. And I think that there are some eligibility language for affordable housing and public housing that we can try to put in there as well, that will give more people access to housing in our community. So a lot of bills that are coming up that to a lot of people might not seem like there's opportunities for housing, but that we can do that in.
Well, and as we close out, I'll note as well that the low-income housing tax credit, the biggest affordable housing program in the country that's actually run by the IRS instead of HUD. But we know that we are continuing to work on an expansion and investment of that to make sure, because we have pipelines of projects, but for funding could advance, and we need more and more housing. So we'll continue to talk with you about that legislation at the federal level as well.
Taxation is also one of the ways that we are trying to see if lenders and landlords can be given a tax credit to forgive some rent. Like if that could be an option, that again wouldn't go through a housing committee, it would go through Ways and Means. But that's another opportunity to say, here's way that we can forgive maybe 30%, 50% of rent.
Well, you have been so generous with your time this morning. Thank you so much for all the work you're doing. You are clearly leading and pushing hard to make sure that our affordable housing challenges are getting addressed. So thank you for your work. Thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me. Have a great day.
Absolutely. So now I'm going to shift our conversation in this moment to looking at the state. There's a lot going on at the local, at our Capitol in St. Paul, and our own Deputy Policy Director, Libby Murphy, is on top of all of it, and she will help provide some context for that and introduce our next guest. Libby?
Thanks, Ann. So I'll just give a quick update about what's happening at the Capitol since we last met 2 weeks ago. It's started to get very busy. A lot of bill hearings have been happening. Minnesota Housing Partnership and Mavity testified on Tuesday on the importance of investments in NOAA. We also submitted written testimony to 2 committees. So things are underway as bills are trying to meet their first deadline, which is March 12th. So that just means that a bill needs to be heard in the body that it was introduced. There are some exceptions to these rules, of course, but we are working furiously to get all these bills heard, especially those that are related to policy or finance. And so things are picking up quickly over at the legislature. I want to pivot to our next featured guest, Chair Fue Lee. He's the chair of the House Capital Investment Committee. We're so excited to have you on, and I will just ask you to make a few comments about what you're doing in your committee and how you are focusing on housing through the Capital Investment Committee, and then encourage people to ask questions through the chat feature for Representative Lee.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and glad to see that our Congresswoman was on here to talk about what's going on at the federal level and here at the state level right now. As you may have seen, I think it was last week or the week before, we had a conversation with the commissioner of the Minnesota Housing Finance Agencies on housing infrastructure bonds. There was a joint hearing. We had members from the Housing Committee and the Preventing Homelessness Committee come in and see how could we address the housing crisis that we have here through capital investment. And we heard about the need, and we saw that the governor came out with his proposal of $100 million in housing infrastructure bonds, and we know that that's not enough. And so I know that there are a few members of the legislature in the House that has a few proposals that's going forward. And so once we get through with some of these initial hearings to lay the groundwork about our priorities for the session, this session and capital investment, really prioritizing racial equity, climate impact, and then housing. And so now that we're done with those conversations, we're starting to get into different bill requests on the different hosts of issues that we are seeing throughout the state. And so once we have some dates figured out, we'll be bringing in our members with their requests for housing infrastructure bonds. I know that Representative Esther Agbaje has one around an available use for housing infrastructure bonds for reoccurring affordable housing. And so we have different proposals out there. I know that Representative Hassan is going to carry a bill around emergency shelters. And so I just wanted to leave it at that and let you know that, housing is a priority of the Capital Investment Committee, and we'll do our best to see if we could come in at a higher number than the governor as we go into negotiation. And it is the position of the House that we do want to get a bonding bill passed this year. Depending on negotiation and what happens in the Senate, we may or may not have one, but I'm really optimistic and hopeful that we could work together to find something to address the housing crisis that we have here. And so if you all have any questions, I'm available to take those right now, and just appreciate being able to be here with all of you this morning.
Thanks. So I want to encourage people to use the chat feature. So you said that the governor's $100 million is not enough, and that is kind of caucus-wide recognized. What is enough? What can you personally support? What do you think your caucus can support? There was a $500 million bonding request from Homes for All last session. We only got $100 million of that. That didn't include any GO bonds for public housing. So can you also talk about kind of the breakdown where you'd like to see housing infrastructure bonds versus general obligation bond investments?
So right now, can't really give a number until we get our targets from our leadership on what we want to put in. And I will say that right now, for me personally, without having any insight on the targets that we have, I really want us to invest more than $100 million. And that's why in the committee, we saw that at least in the last round of applicants to the housing finance agencies, I believe there was a gap of at least $220 million. And understanding the need is at $400 million, but just the last round, there was a gap of 220. And, maybe that's a start for us. How could we fulfill that gap that wasn't funded in the last round, knowing that the need overall is greater than that, and start having the conversation through that lens. And also, the conversation about public housing rehab too. I think that we have, to do our duty to really start addressing some of that. For myself personally, having live in public housing, I understand the value of having that for some of our lowest income Minnesotans, and we need to really help support them so that they could, get going, with the rest of their lives. And so we need to really look at housing infrastructure bonds for affordable housing and some of the recurring housing option, and also public housing rehab.
Thank you. So you mentioned that you heard in committee that there was a request for $220 million in bonds for housing, but that isn't speaking to the full need. And I just want to highlight, I spoke with developers who didn't end up applying because they weren't certain that there would be a bonding bill. How is there momentum? How does the legislature address this uncertainty? Certainty is very important for housing. These are projects that, are 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 years in the making. How do we ensure that there is a consistency in the bonding bill in terms of not just when we can expect bonds for housing, but also the level of investments are going up? Houseman likes to talk about, we invested $100 million 4 years ago. It's time to invest more than that. Is there any momentum to address those issues?
I think that the momentum has to start with all of you who are at the ground, who are at the grassroots, where you really need to contact your own legislature and really push them to support housing, so that as we move on the legislative process, we could push our leadership, and also those in the position like myself, Senator Bach in the Senate, and Representative Erdogan, the Republican League, and Senator Pappas, the Democrat league in the Senate. And we need that grassroots supports. And if we're not hearing from you, or if we're just all hearing from you all, but my committee members are not hearing from you, my leadership is not hearing from you, then we won't have that push to really get a bonding bill off the floor. And I think that's what we were seeing, where we understand the need. And over the last 2 years before we finally got the bill passed in October, there weren't a willingness to get enough votes in the House to really get that off the floor to send it to the Senate. And so know that a lot of members, they support housing, but what do we need to do in order to get them to vote yes when we bring up a bonding bill to the floor? And I think that's where we need the grassroots support and push from all of you to get your legislative member to say that we need to stop with the politicization of bonding or housing or on any issues, and really put up the votes so that we could really move forward with the request and the proposal that we have in front of us, so that we could start investing in housing and the other issues that are part of the bonding bill.
Well, I hope everyone on the call heard that call to action from you to engage their lawmakers. So you briefly mentioned you're not sure about the prospects of a bonding bill. Can you expand a little bit on that? For people who are on the call who are maybe a little less familiar with the legislative process, what does it take to get a bonding bill passed? And what are other paths? We saw, I think it was 2 years ago, where housing infrastructure bonds had a standalone bill. So that is a path. And can you just talk about what you think could happen at the end of this legislative session?
So for folks who may not be as familiar over at the Capitol, capital investment or the bonding bill, it's pretty unique, where we need super majorities in the House and Senate in order for us to send it to the governor. So we need at least 81 votes in the House, and I forgot the number in the Senate. But if we don't get the support, then we cannot get a bill forward. And understanding that for the bonding bill, we need funding from the general fund to pay for the debt service. And for this year, we have seen from the budget forecast saying that if we were not to put any general fund dollars into the debt service, that we have the capacity to bond for a bill of approximately $240 million. And considering the needs that we have in the state, that's quite small. And so, but MMB has also said that right now we have the capacity for a $3.2 billion bonding bill too. And so it really depends on the priorities of the legislature to see where they want to put their investment. And, knowing me, I will be advocating to my leadership in the House to get the largest bonding bill that we can, so that we can start putting together a bill that address housing, address some of the other needs that we have across the state of Minnesota. And so it's crucial that all of you start, advocating with your legislative members in the House and in the Senate to let them know that, the people in the state of Minnesota expect a bonding bill to get passed this year, so that we could start addressing some of the needs that we have, chipping away at the housing issue, and hopefully in the 2022 session that we could make a larger investment into housing.
Yeah, thanks. And I just want to reiterate for people on the call, just the importance of engaging early, engaging now, before some of those targets and before some of those conversations have already happened. Now is the time to make those calls. And that's a good reminder for me too, to put together an action alert and other types of alerts and calls to action. There's a question, from your perspective, what do the House Republicans want? What will get them to say yes to a bonding bill?
It's too early right now, but I think that at least my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I think there's a general agreement, as you may have heard from the committee, that they support housing, but what is it that's outside of bonding that may hold them back from supporting a bonding bill? And so I think that's a conversation that folks on the call, if you do have a Republican member or Democratic member, really engaging with them to see, what does it take for you to help support a bonding bill this year. And so I can't really answer that for my House Republican colleagues and even for some of my Democratic colleagues, but do know that as the chair of the Capital Investment Committee, I'm working towards a proposal that hopefully everyone in the legislature can support. And, a main piece of that will be housing. And so I hope that, if you do have a Republican legislator that represent you, really having that engagement right now to see what can we do to work with them to get something off the floor.
Well, I just one last question. You mentioned that you've now held hearings on racial equity, climate, and housing. Can you speak a little bit about how those three issues have risen to the top? Because I would say it wasn't even that long ago when housing was maybe a top 10 issue, but now for you, it's a top 3 issue that you're hearing in your committee.
That's really the priority of the memberships. I think that you may be seeing across the board in the House at least that the different chairs that they have different priorities, and the memberships of the committees that have different priorities. And we have met with the members of the committees, and I know that the Democratic members of the Capital Investment Committee really want to prioritize racial equity, prioritize the climate crisis and the impact that it have on our infrastructure, and also on housing because of the great need. And you have seen within the House that the Speaker has 2 housing committees. I don't think that we have that before. One, just the housing committee overall, and then the division that Chair Gomez is leading on preventing homelessness. And I think that shows where our priorities are. And so wanted to put it at the forefront and to really lay the foundation that any bonding bill that we're going to have has to address those main critical issues that we are facing as a state.
Well, maybe I'll just ask you actually one more question, because you brought up that there's some bills that are coming for some new eligible uses. Can you speak a little bit about kind of momentum for some of these new uses, with also balancing making sure that there's enough investment to support the existing uses that have recently been expanded?
So that's an ongoing conversation, and like I said, we haven't really had that discussion in our committee, and I'll be honest, I haven't really been paying attention to what's going on in the housing committee, and so I don't know if they have engaged in some of that conversation. And I think this is where we need to have engagement and conversation in both committees and really see what can we do, understanding that we need to really have full funding for some of the currently eligible use before we bring in those use, but also balancing the fact that we know that there are different needs out there that we need to make sure that our funding is flexible. And so hopefully within the next month, we can start having those conversations. And I encourage all of you, once we have those date and those bills ready for presentation, to come in with public testimony, whether that's to join us in a virtual hearing or to provide written comments that will be part of the record for the committee going forward.
Well, thank you so much, Representative Lee. This is very informative. And I don't know if you have an opportunity to stay on. If you do, there might be some additional questions in the chat. If not, I will certainly send those to you if we get any more questions that are relevant to your work on the Capital Investment Committee. But so thank you so much. Wonderful to see you this morning.
Thank you.
Next up, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Jon Gutzmann, from the Executive Director of the St. Paul Public Housing Authority. I'll leave it to Jon to make a few comments, and then also again encourage people to use the chat feature for any questions you have of Jon as he talks about the needs of public housing and kind of reacting maybe to some of what he's heard from our state and federal representatives today.
Thank you very much, Libby. Thank you, Ann. Thank you, Representative Vu and Congresswoman Omar. I'll talk briefly for 5 minutes about the Public Housing Agency of the City of St. Paul and then take your questions. An important fact is that public housing represents less than 1% of the housing supply of America. There's 1 million units of public housing in America. There's 133 million units of housing in America. If you add the HCV program, the Section 8, the other HUD programs, there's about 5 million units of housing that are deeply subsidized at 30% of AMI in America. And Ann Mavity was correct That houses the 1 out of 4 who are eligible. The tax credit program is about 3 million units nationwide. At St. Paul Public Housing, we have 4,300 units of public housing that we own and manage. And we have 4,900 Section 8 housing choice vouchers where people rent in the private market. Those 9,200 affordable housing opportunities house 21,000 low-income people in St. Paul. Average incomes are about 16,000 to 18,000 per year. That's 22 to 25% of AMI. Minneapolis and all the housing authorities in the country, we are really the housers of people at around 20, 25% AMI. We have 30 years of data that confirm the average stay in public housing is about 7 years, belying a lot of myths and stereotypes. The insured value of our 4,300 units that we own is about $729 million. That's all federal funding that came to St. Paul to build the inventory. Our capital needs on that $729 million asset are about $84 million over the next 20 years. We do spend about $10 million a year on capital investments to keep our property safe and sound. Side note, last year, 4.3 million went to Section 3 construction companies. So our main goal is always federal help, federal dollars to preserve this federal asset. A few other stats, we've had a 95% occupancy in public housing for 25 consecutive years. We've been 100% utilized in our Section 8 program for over the last 5 years, even in tight rental markets. We have a 30-year record of collecting 99% of the rents, and that has changed with COVID. We now have over $460,000 in delinquent rent. 588 tenants owe that amount. If that remains on the books, that's about a 3.5% delinquency rate when we've had about a 0.5% over 30 years. Obviously, federal help with fully funding public housing production and capitalization. We are looking forward to the infrastructure bill. I'm glad Congresswoman brought that up. My knowledge is that will be the source for public housing capital. The current bill that's being debated, I don't think will have it. When there was the Recovery Act funding under President Obama, we got $17 million of additional rehab dollars. We put every penny into construction and rehab. I created a publication to rebut some of the wild claims out of Washington that it was all spent on waste, fraud, and abuse. We documented 17 million in, 17 million. We listed all the contractors, all their dollar amounts, every penny went to construction. For the state, obviously, any capital investments of state dollars for public housing is just incredible. We're one of the only states in the nation who does such a thing. We have had previous state capital dollars. We have shovel-ready projects to go. My colleagues at Minnesota NARO are testifying before Representative Vu's committee. We all have projects for boilers, plumbing repair, elevator repair, life safety repair. Couple last notes. We did install fire suppression sprinklers in all of our high rises from 1991 to 2011. That's 16 high rises. It took 20 years to do it. It cost $8.3 million. And another kind of fun fact on the green initiative side of the world, 10 of our high rises are 100% powered by community solar. And it's just an amazing thing. It not only is green and no carbon footprint, but we are actually locking in $125,000 of savings for the next 25 years. You can go to our website to learn a lot more about public housing, www.stpha.org. I have not talked about our Housing Choice Voucher Program, our project-based voucher program, which is our main answer to the homeless issue. I noted Deidre Schmidt was on the call. We're so proud that we recently awarded 60 project-based vouchers to make the very first affordable housing development at the Ford site, which Common Bond owns. It'll be 100% affordable to people at 30% AMI. With that, I know I've covered a lot. I haven't looked at the comments, but Libby, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thank you. That was very, very informative. I certainly learned a lot. Thank you. So we do have a question. During the 2008 to 2013 recession, St. Paul Public Housing sold many of their assets. Are there plans to add to St. Paul Public Housing's inventory to meet the need?
Well, during that recession, it was actually 2008 when we sold, I think, only 15 scattered site units. We've never sold many assets. We're in the business of owning them forever. That was like, I think it was the last year of the Bush administration. We've been cut. And we did sell a few scattered sites. We have no plans to sell anything. We are hopefully able to produce, but it's all federally funded. There's been no public housing production pipeline since the mid-'80s. The only growth in our world is the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which through a long story, we can project base, which we can project base to ourselves, perhaps in a future public housing development. But our plan is to preserve everything and grow as we are able.
Thank you. So you mentioned that you have had 100% utilization rate of your Section 8 vouchers. But can you speak a little bit? So Minnesota Housing Partnership, along with many others on this call, are supportive of the work to amend our Human Rights Act to prohibit source of income discrimination. Can you speak a little bit about some of the challenges that are faced by those who have a Section 8 voucher?
Yes, what a lot of people gravitate towards are the folks who are not able to place a voucher. And we mark that, we call that success rate. So the first indicator is we have 4,900 vouchers. If you take that times 12, there's roughly 55,000 unit months available. And for 4 years running, we have had 55,000 unit months leased. I don't know how we do it. It's incredible. So every voucher is used. So second tier, some people didn't place their voucher. We have about an 85% success rate. So 15% don't place. What goes on there is at the heart of this question. And of course, there is some discrimination against some voucher seekers. And there are probably some legitimate reasons a private landlord says no. So there's a spectrum there. From our point of view, that voucher returned, the 15% who didn't place it, it's reissued, the next person in line places it. So on a month-by-month basis, we're churning the waiting list and we're 100% occupied. But I get these broader societal issues around what happens when someone can't place their voucher. And I, of course, get the issues around landlords who outright discriminate or refuse. So we are kind of on the sideline of those broader debates, those legal debates. We are primarily looking at this from a production entity and ensuring we utilize every precious resource we have.
Well, thank you so much, John. It was a really informative overview that you gave, and we're very grateful to have you on this morning. I'm going to pivot back to Ann to close us out for this morning.
Great, thank you. And yes, and I will highlight, we are working on this legislation to make sure that folks who get vouchers are able to use them. So folks can go to MHP's website to get more information on how to continue to advocate. And I see that Michael Dahl has put some information in the chat. Look at that and get that link. Homeline also hosts regular webinars on tenant landlord issues that you can listen into. It sounds like one will be next Wednesday. So again, thank you to all of our panelists. You know, there's so many challenging housing needs right now that we are facing. The good news is that it's gotten folks' attention, and all of you and using your voice can make an enormous difference. So continue to look for our updates, share them with your colleagues. Our next call will be next Friday, March 5th. So we'll let you know about the lineup of speakers as that gets finalized. But again, Chair Fue Lee did our work for us. Go out there and get active. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great day.